Hello and welcome to Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives. I'm your host, Dan Dick. Welcome to this week's episode about fascinating people, places, and events from Mennonite history.
Ik naam de geschicht de eerste Weihnachten in Canada, 1875.
That was Gerhard Ens introducing his story, The First Christmas in Canada, 1875, which he authored in Low German. Gerhard was born in 1922 in the Soviet Union, emigrated to Canada as an infant in 1923, and died in Manitoba in 2011. Vocationally, Gerhard was many things: a teacher, newspaper editor, broadcaster, lay minister, a conscientious objector during World War II, a founding member of the Manitoba Mennonite Historical Society, and a storyteller. He was passionate about preserving the Low German language. In The First Christmas in Canada, 1875, Gerhard paints a picture of his fictional character, 13-year-old Obraum, the struggles and joys of Obraum's family, and his childhood anticipation of Christmas celebrations. The story is one of several Christmas stories Ens wrote. Others include The First Christmases in Mexico, Paraguay, and others, written in Low German and broadcast on the radio. Gerhard first presented the original Low German version of The First Christmas in Canada, 1875, on the radio on December 10th, 1973. You're going to hear a few of Ens's original Low German excerpts sprinkled throughout today's English translation of his story. For listeners accustomed to our usual 15-minute episodes, be aware that we'll be running a little over our usual time to bring you this special Christmas feature. The First Christmas in Canada, 1875, by Gerhard Ens. It was Christmas Eve. Outside, it was freezing cold. The thermometer probably showed 20 degrees below zero. That could be about accurate. In the village, only 1 or 2 families owned a thermometer, but the chill was very obvious when one ventured outdoors to muck out the barn. Not that there was much to do outdoors these days. There was our sarai, our small stable with a cow and a young pig in it. The pair of oxen that usually stood in their stall in the sarai had been away from home for a few days now. 13-year-old Obraum went to check once more to see that the door had been closed tightly, and if a little more bedding straw was needed. The animals had no hay for the stock's night feeding. The cattle would be fortunate to make it through the winter. After Obraum had seen to the chores, he headed slowly back to the house. The sun was setting. In the southwest beyond the Pembina Hills, in the direction of North Dakota, the winter sky was aglow in a golden twilight. A vast prairie of even snow stretched endlessly to the wide horizons. Obraum paused for a moment to survey the winter landscape, and then continued walking. Under his feet, the snow crunched crisply and clearly as he strode to their house. Except it wasn't a house. Everyone called it a zemlin. When they'd first arrived late in the summer of 1875, all the men had divided up the land for the small groups of families and set up their villages. Next, to each family head who qualified for a homestead, a house, yard, and homestead had been allocated. Then the work had begun. The days had been hot. The days had been long. They had labored from early mornings to late in the evenings. First, simple shelters had been constructed. That was the sarai where now their few head of cattle, including their oxen, were overwintering. They had quickly made a garden and seeded feed grain for the cattle. The main focus and work was to prepare for winter. To do that, everyone had to pitch in. Of course, Pau had done most of the work. From early mornings to late evenings, Pau had toiled and sweated. At 12 years old, Obraum was the firstborn son. He'd turned 13 in October, on the 16th, according to the new North American calendar, and he'd had to work as hard as a full-grown man. Never before had he worked that hard. First, they'd built their new serai, hauling slender tree trunks from the wooded Pembina hills. They had cut and bound into bundles some of the creek grass to chink the walls that also served as a roof. Then they'd cut the prairie grasses to use as hay fodder for their oxen and the one cow they had purchased in Dufferin. Obraum's sister Zauna was 18. She too had worked hard, and Mama. Mama had done a great deal of outdoor work, raking hay into high stacks. Pau always said that Mama was the one who did that best. The haystacks he made always looked slanted or slid apart. Perhaps Pau only said this to encourage Mama to take on the slightly lighter work. Pau himself had almost worked himself to death, pitching hay with a large pitchfork that he had crafted in his smithy. And yet all the haystacks were small, much smaller than they'd been in Russia.
Jo, in Russland. Obraum kamen trotz seiner 13 Jahre immer war der meiste Tronen, wenn in Russland dacht.
Yes, in Russia. Despite his 13 years, Obraum came close to tears whenever he thought about Russia. There in Rosengard, in the old colony, they'd had a wonderful farm. Oh, they'd had to work hard there, too. But he had looked forward to school every fall and winter. And then, by March, the weather would turn warm enough. In the months without the letter R, they could go barefoot and go swimming. Here in Manitoba, they had no dugout where they could swim. The village was laid out along a creek. That's how the village men had set it up. But it dried up in summer. He hoped that spring would bring enough rain so that the river flowed again. Undoubtedly, by swimming season, it would be all dried up again. Pau and the other men had discussed the land west of their village, a low-lying area. By building a good dam, they could have a sizable pond for their cattle. But that could take years. No, thought Obraum, we have made a poor trade, leaving our beautiful Rosengard in Russia to settle here on the wild prairie. He stepped inside now, into the warm but rather dark and not particularly comfortable room. Nevertheless, this Zemlin would have to do as their home this winter. In autumn, when the days and nights had begun to turn colder, Pau had marked off a large square on level ground. Then he'd sliced off the top layer of grass sod and laid it aside. After that, all four of them, Pau, Obraum, Mama, and Zauna, had worked to dig a square hole 3 feet deep into the earth. Pau had neatly trimmed the edges or walls so that they were very straight, and then they stacked all the sods along the edges and built them up so that from the floor bottom the wall reached up to a height of 7 feet. Over the top of these walls they placed slender tree trunks as beams to support the thinner sods and river grass they then placed on them for a roof. The only carpentry work done had been on the door and window frames. This kind of building was secure enough to stay warm in winter, but one could not say that it was cozy and comfortable. Obraum saw that Mama and Zauna had supper ready, a simple meal. They had planted potatoes last summer and harvested a sackful. They had also managed to bring several pails of lard with them from Russia, and the cow was still producing a little bit of milk. They need not go hungry just yet, and when the bread assistance from their brothers and sisters in the east arrived, they could manage to make it through the winter somehow. For this reason, Pau and several other men from their village had hitched up their ox teams and headed to Dufferin. That was at least 40 miles, and the round trip always took several days, as long as they would not run into a blizzard. But if, at Dufferin, the Schult, who managed supplies, told them that flour and other necessities had also arrived, they'd pick that up too. If only they'd arrive back home today. Tomorrow would be Christmas Day. Mama's face was filled with worry. Zauna was quiet and preoccupied as well. Only little Doft was excited. "Mama," he asked again, "what will I get for Christmas?" That may have been the precise reason for Mama's concern. She knew that it was doubtful that anyone would be getting presents for Christmas this year. They would all be thankful if at least their necessities would last them through the winter. Of course, she could not say that to Doft, not wanting to spoil his happiness. And Zauna? Yes, Zauna was well aware that the first Christmas in this new land would be very different. But something else was troubling her. Her thoughts kept returning to Yeats's Frauens and Rosengart in Russia. The Yeatses had also planned to be part of the large group to America, but when Tante Yeatsche had suddenly fallen ill, they had had to postpone their journey. Zauna had heard nothing at all from Frauens since the day she and her family had left on the journey, and she and Frauens loved each other. They had both joined the church in spring, being baptized by Altaste Isaac Ditch from Kortitz, and planned to marry this past summer. How could that happen now? If Tante Yeatsche were to have a lingering illness, their plans to emigrate might collapse completely, and then she would never see her dear Frauens ever again.
Waarom werden zij eigentlich uit Russland uitgewanderd? Veel gevraagd hadden Obraum en Zauna niemals. Dat wir bij aan nicht moud.
Oh, why had they ever left Russia at all? Neither Obraum nor Zauna were in the habit of asking grown-ups many questions. That was just not done. But both had ideas and thoughts that kept to themselves. Obraum could clearly remember what Altesta Weeb, or Om Yahon, as everyone knew him, had said about the matter last summer and fall. Not so much in his sermons, which were usually long, during which more than once Obraum's eyes had slowly closed. He'd been exhausted from doing the work of a grown man all week, and on hot Sunday mornings one could rest up so nicely in a cool serai. The flies buzzed so soothingly, and gradually Om Yahon's preaching voice seemed very far away, so that Obraum kept drifting off, but waking with a start, as though he said Amen to and agreed with everything in Om Yahon's sermon. But after he'd read aloud his sermon in High German, Om Yahon always spoke to the congregation in Plotich, looking directly at the assembled people instead of at his book, and speaking more conversationally, not in his preacher voice. In Plotich, he told them that the loving God had brought them to this land just as he had brought his children, the Israelites, into Canaan. For Obraum, that name somehow merged with the name of their new land, Canada. It sounded almost like Canaan, even though not much milk and honey were flowing here. He simply accepted that Om Yahon, his parents, and all the other families had emigrated out of a humble obedience to God. How was he supposed to grasp all that stuff about Russian politics and Canadian politics and all the rest? He just knew that he missed his home in Russia, but accepted that their loving God had new plans for them. When they finished their supper, Zauna rinsed a few cups and plates in melted snow water, and then began their wait for Pau. He told them that if all went well, he planned to be home by Christmas Eve. Mama picked up a woolen stocking and began to darn the hole in its heel. Obraum always admired the way she could repair an old sock or stocking to have it look almost new again. Zauna picked up her embroidery, but without much interest. She had brought kerchiefs and pillowcases and shawls with patterns, as well as colorful embroidery floss with her from Russia. She had hoped to have these shawls and linens ready for her wedding day, but how would that happen now? None of them felt much inclined to think about the joys of Christmas. Eventually Doft spoke up. "Mama, I'm going to bed. Tomorrow will be Christmas Day." "Yes," said Mama. "Get ready for bed, and then I will pray the evening prayer with you." Doft stepped out of his shoes and took off his pants and his socks and his jacket, and then crawled into the broch, a daybed that opened up for two to sleep in. Mama came to his bedside, and together they prayed. "I am small. My heart is pure. No one shall dwell in it but Jesus alone. Amen." Then Mama said to him, "So, my little Doft, now remember this. Tomorrow will be Christmas Day, Jesus' birthday. That is the most beautiful part of all Christmas. For that we can all be filled with joy." "Yes," said Doft as his eyes closed reluctantly, and in a minute he was in Poseland, the land of sleep and dreams. Time passed slowly as they waited through the quiet evening. Suddenly they heard sounds from outside, the trampling of heavy oxen feet and sled runners in the crisp snow amid men's voices.
Paus thuis, roept Obraum.
"Pa is home!" Obraum exclaimed. Mamma's eyes had brightened. She had not wanted the children to see how worried she was about her yash. Obraum quickly slipped into his jacket and boots and ran outside to help unharness the pair of tired oxen. He led them into the serai, where he fed them bundles of fresh hay. Pau picked several items out of the sled and carried them indoors. "Well, Auna, we were very fortunate," he said after he'd taken off his heavy overcoat and warmly lined boots and sat down for his fried potatoes. He pretended that his prips, a hot drink made from roasted barley, was as delicious as coffee. "Yes, we were fortunate. The flour had arrived, enough to last for a few months, perhaps until spring. Those who had money could buy. For those who couldn't, enough was available for them to buy it on credit. The Canadian government is giving us money for flour, seed grain, and machinery. We'll have a few years to pay it back when we're on our feet. Our brothers in the East have guaranteed repayment." And thus hope as well as Christmas joy entered their Zemlin. When Pau had finished his supper, it appeared that something had suddenly occurred to him. But Obraum knew his father well enough. Pau could be speaking very seriously, yet his eyes and expression let Obraum see that all was just fine. "Son," he suddenly declared, "you're still up. Quickly now, get to bed, or Christmas Day won't be coming." Obraum needn't be told twice. Within a minute he was in the pouch next to Doft. He said a quiet prayer and then crawled under the comforter. Doft stirred in his sleep. Exhaustion was catching up with Obraum, but he did hear Pau go out and come back in again. It was clear that Pau was carrying something, and it didn't sound like a bag of flour. Who knew? Maybe they would receive Christmas presents after all. Only Zauna remained silent, but then Pau again suddenly appeared to remember something. "Oh, Zoontje, some mail had arrived in Dufferin, and here is some for you." Zauna instantly sprang up from her chair and nearly ripped the letter out of Pau's hand. Obraum heard her open the letter and begin to read. He was curious enough to aim a quick, sleepy glance at her. He had not seen Zauna cry for quite some time, and now he was almost embarrassed to see a few tears roll down her cheeks. But that she wasn't sad was obvious to him. For the first time in his life, he realized that one could also cry out of sheer happiness. Yes, Zauna had a letter from Jezus Frans. In it was the news that all was ready. His mother was well again, and next spring they would be on the first ship to America. Obraum did not know any of this yet, but he sensed that the letter contained some very welcome news. Finally, even Pau and Mama and Zauna went to bed. Obraum lay awake for a few more minutes. A warm Christmas feeling of comfort fell over him. Pau and Mama were nearby. In his sleep, Doft flung his arm over Obraum. Zauna was asleep, feeling reassured again. Far away in the east, people cared about them, and a good government wasn't letting them starve. All of this he sensed more than he could have expressed. Just before he fell asleep, a specific verse came to him, one they had learned for Christmas time last year at school for their teacher, Leda Schallenboch. It was from Isaiah 7, verse 14.
Siehe, eine Jungfrau wird einen Sohn gebären, den wird sie heißen Immanuel.
Behold, a virgin will give birth to a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. Their teacher had explained that Emmanuel meant God with us, and now he also understood Om Yahon when he said that the loving God had brought them to this land and that he would be with them all. As he drifted off to sleep, he could almost hear the song leader Oomtje Zacharias in church with his deep voice lead. Let all together praise our God upon his regal throne, for he unlocks his heaven today and gives to us his Son, and gives to us his Son.
Schenkt uns seinen Sohn. Kommt aus seines Vaters Schoß und wird ein Kindlein klein. Liegt dort elend, nackt und bloß.
That concludes our Christmas feature. Photos of Gerhard Ens, his book, and his audio recordings are held at the Mennonite Heritage Archives. To learn more or listen to this episode again, visit mharchives.ca. If you have questions or comments about this program, dash them off in an email to info@mharchives.ca.
I'm Archivist Conrad Stace. Thanks for listening to Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives. Thanks to our partners, Canadian Mennonite University, Centre for Transnational Mennonite Studies, and Mennonite Church Canada. This program is made possible through support from Golden West Radio and listeners like you. If you want to support this program and the work of the archives, you can find out how to do that on our website at mharchives.ca and click on support.
Join me again next week for a special New Year's feature about a unique Mennonite tradition involving an unusual musical instrument called the Obraum. Thanks to Gerhard J. Ens and family for allowing us to share their father's Christmas story. Helene Warkentin translated the story into English. Matt Pauls, the Faith and Life Men's Choir, and the CNBC Radio Choir provided the music. Research, writing, and editing for this episode involved Conrad Stace and me. Special thanks to Golden West Radio for giving us some extra time for this Christmas special. I'm your host, Dan Dick. Tales from the Mennonite Heritage Archives will return next week with more stories about people, places, and events from Mennonite history. Thanks for listening.